A couple of weeks ago, we featured a KX500 two-stroke motor crowbarred into a 250 motard frame. That was eye-opening in a pant-wetting sort of way. It was spectacular, but someone out there thought that this build was somewhat not ambitious enough. And so we have this. Something seemingly out of a Mad Max flick, partially because it says so on the tank, but even so, the theme is unmistakable. What it is a frame from an early 1980s motor Guzzi, and crowbarring doesn't seem to be an appropriate enough word for what there's been squeezed into here, because that motor is a 2-litre V4 from a Ford Capri car. So Guzzi frame, Ford motor.
I mean, what could possibly go wrong?
Of course, a car motor of this magnitude doesn't just slip into a Guzzi frame. In fact, the frame had to be somewhat dismembered and reassembled, except wider and longer.
This thing is just 90% engine. It's basically an engine with a bit of metal like bolted onto it. That's what this is.
The motor is all Ford, except the gearbox. Keeping the original gears would have been heavy, complicated, and would require a car-style gear stick changed with the hand, or something fittingly known as a suicide shift. That wouldn't do, so the original Guzzi gearbox was cleverly incorporated into the Ford motor, and it works, mostly.
So you can feel it's an old gearbox, an old school gearbox. It's a really long throw and a very heavy flywheel. So sometimes you hit a false neutral, but you actually adjust your riding style to that. And the harder you push it, the easier the gear changes become. In town and in slow traffic, yeah, the gear changes are a bit of a challenge.
There we go, wait, gotta change gear. Ugh. It's, yeah, the gearbox takes a bit of it's a bit of trial and error. So every time you want to change gear, you sort of have to go, no, not quite. Okay, there we go, got it. You got to earn your gears. It doesn't just let you have them. You got to work for them. It's like a sense of achievement. Yeah, all right, you've worked hard. You can have third gear. Oh, well, thank you very much.
After a reasonable amount of search and rescue, you eventually find a gear. And then it is time to open the throttle and send that motor firing on all 4 cylinders. And here is where it gets surprising.
First impression when I first saw this bike, I was a little bit nervous. It was built in 2 weeks. Total build time was 2 weeks. I was a little bit nervous about riding it. I was expecting to be a complete rattle trap, a complete death trap. And it wasn't.
It's surprisingly smooth, considering that this is just a giant engine bolted directly on a piece of metal, bolted directly onto the metal frame, bolted directly onto the metal handlebars with the thin bits of rubber and the grips. I really thought this thing was going to shake and rattle and be all over the place. I thought I'd be spending the night tonight in an orthopedic ICU after every single joint in my body is rattled loose, but it's actually alright, and it's surprisingly comfortable. I thought the bars are kind of very far forward. I mean, that makes sense. It's got to accommodate an engine. And the foot pegs are quite far back. The seat's nice and comfortable, soft. It's nice. It's a nice cruising bike.
Obviously, you'd expect a motor of this side to be blisteringly fast. But let's keep in mind that 2-litre cars from the 70s are not quite what they are today. Actually, this exact model pushes just 99 horsepower, which is, well, it's less than a 600 motorcycle. However, it also stomps out 156 Nm of torque, and that makes a difference.
This motor will hold whatever speed you're doing right now all day. Although I will say it's not particularly fast. It sounds like it should be fast. It sounds like, very, very light, comparatively light vehicle towed by this giant motor meant to pull something much heavier. And, it's okay, but it's not ridiculously fast. However, it does give the impression that the speed it will do it could do if you had an Australian road train, about a kilometre long of road train bolted onto the back of this thing, then it would make no difference whatsoever. Uphill, downhill, it feels nothing.
And a lot of engine takes a lot of fuel, so this bike has 2 fuel tanks, one at the back behind the seat and one in the traditional spot in the front. Both handmade and made quite well.
We just filled up the tank and there is a faint whiff of petrol. I'm getting a bit lightheaded.
Then there's the rest of the bike. What we essentially have here is a collection of old parts off of classic motorcycles that have been salvaged and repurposed. This build took 336 hours of careful hard work. So what is it exactly? Well, apart from the headlights that look like they were nicked from an Iron Maiden concert, we know the frame is from a Guzzi and the motor is from a Ford. But then there are the wheels, which are also from the original Guzzi, and the twin rear shocks, which are too from a Guzzi, although extended to fit the somewhat heightened frame.
The suspension feels very sort of old school, you know, the damping's a bit weird. And also keep in mind, it's a lot heavier, this bike is a lot heavier than the suspension was made to tackle, and yet it's doing it. When you try and push the suspension hard braking, all that kind of thing, very bumpy roads, you can feel it kind of getting out of sorts, but now like this on the open road, it feels pretty good.
The front forks are from a Kawasaki Z1300 and the brakes are from a Honda 400. And here we have to wonder what happens when going straight is no longer an option.
Weirdly, this bike turns. And that's surprising because I really thought that the first corner I was going to come to, I was going to turn in and nothing would happen. The thing would not want to steer, it would just carry on straight on. The brakes wouldn't work, and they do actually work surprisingly well. And I thought it would just carry on going straight and I'd go off the road and it would take about 6 mountains before I eventually ground to a halt. But no, I mean, I'm not pushing hard, I'm not trying to put my knee down, but you know, it turns. It's actually not bad. It really is not bad. I've had bikes much worse than this. I'm going to suggest that even the original Rocket 3, the first of the big Triumph Rocket 3s, I reckon that was a worse handling motorcycle than this. That's a bit of high praise for this.
For a garage built out of that Fergal headline, scrap that Fergal headline is garage. It's a lot better than what you expect it to be. It's really well put together. In fact, so well put together, it almost becomes a non-event riding it. I was expecting this really like dangerous, scary motorcycle to ride, difficult to handle. It is such a smooth handling bike.
It's our job to make judgments on motorcycles, to speak of their talents and their downfalls. And compared to something out of a big factory, this machine has its shortcomings. But honestly, who cares?
So here's the thing, whether this bike is good or not is irrelevant. It makes no difference because it just has to work. And it does work, it works actually very well. It was a guy who built this himself. And I love that people do that. You can't help but love this motorcycle. You can't help but love it. Even if it was far worse than it is, and it's really not bad at all. Honestly, it's a privilege riding this thing. I do. I feel lucky that there are people who build bikes like this, and I got a chance to ride one of them.
Any day on a motorbike is my favorite day. Today was my most favorite day on a motorbike.